Welcome to the keynote session, Bridging to Citizen Science. My name is Lars Egeland. I'm a member of the IATUL board and director of Oslo Metropolitan University Library. Due to some technical problem with my camera, you won't be able to see me, but the important thing is that you will be able to see and hear Sarita, which I have the pleasure to introduce. Sarita Albagli is a sociologist and also a PhD in political geography, senior researcher at the Brazilian Institute of Information in Science and Technology, professor of the graduate program in information science developed by IBICT and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, head of Open Science and Citizen Innovation Laboratory. She is also Senior Grantee Fellow of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development and the Carlos Chagas Foundation for Research Support of the State of Rio de Janeiro. Sarita has led multidisciplinary teams and developed interinstitutional and international projects on open science, has supervised more than 40 PhD theses, master science dissertations, and post-doctoral studies in information science. Among other publications, she has edited the book Open Science, Open Issues. We look forward to hearing more about citizen science. The floor is yours, Sarita.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Please let me know if it is working. Can you see?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. So, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this session. It is a shame that it was not possible to have this meeting in person. It would be much nicer to have wine together in this beautiful city after our conversation. My presentation is based on the conceptual and experimental work that I and my research group at the Open Science to social change. I have structured my presentation in 4 argumentative axes as follows. My first point is to place the debate in the context of urgency and complexity of the critical state of the world today, in particular, the climate emergency and the sanitary emergency. If the COVID pandemic had not occurred a year ago, I would have been talking about open and citizen science in the context of the climate emergency. The outbreak of the COVID-19 made the global social environmental crisis and its anthropogenic character even more evident and dramatic. Pandemics can be considered emergency and disaster situations, given their magnitude, atypical character, and the difficulty of isolated responses due to their cross-border spread. The COVID-19 pandemic is a sanitary and humanitarian crisis that is more properly characterized as a syndemic, involving environmental, political, social, economic, and migratory aspects and consequences. The consequences of current environmental and sanitary emergencies are global and thus require articulated efforts on a planetary scale. But their causes and impacts are different and unequal, and they are especially felt by the most vulnerable regions and social groups. It brings into question the need and the viability to promote joint efforts for and dialogue on our endangered collective futures. On the one hand, everyone is under threat and has to act on it. On the other hand, the impacts of the crisis and conditions to tackle it are not equally distributed. It is evident that the capacity for the production, access, and analysis of qualified data and knowledge is strategic for effective prevention, monitoring, and intervention on these emergency and disaster situations. Less recognized is the fact that this would require a new global knowledge and information regime, in which open science should have centrality in order to expand the circulation of knowledge with the speed and volume required to fight these situations, the pandemic in particular. It should also be noted that most of humanity is excluded from major scientific infrastructure, or rather it is included in an exclusionary mode. In quantitative terms, most science is produced or at least made visible in the countries that concentrate just 1/5 of the planet's population. The scenario is even more dramatic, at least for most Latin American countries, particularly in Brazil today, with the drastic cutbacks and the unprecedented dismantling of the institutional infrastructure that supports public research and education. According to the Open Knowledge Foundation, open science means many things, but primarily scientific knowledge that people are free to use, reuse, and distribute without legal, technological, or social restrictions. The open science movement was initially driven by the movement for open access to scientific publications, which emerged in the last decade of the 20th century in reaction to the high prices charged by commercial publishers. Almost 20 years after the Budapest Open Access Initiative, the open science movement has incorporated new issues into its agenda, expanding its scope. Therefore, more than an umbrella term, open science can be understood as a movement of movements, that is, a process under construction which encompasses several fronts, from open scientific publications and research data, open scientific tools and infrastructures, software and hardware, to citizen science. It involves different actors and levels of intervention at the individual, meso, and macro levels. They express different and sometimes conflicting interests and points of view in asymmetric positions in power relations. Very schematically, we have, on the one hand, those who aspire to expand the means of collaboration in research by opening its results. It is supposed that the opening of science allows for greater productivity, quality, and social return from research, maximizing results and avoiding redundancy, facilitating collaboration and reproducibility. On the other hand, powerful economic agents, commercial publishers in particular, have developed new business models aimed at maintaining or even extending their profit rates and their control of decision-making systems of scientific communication. Such business models include open access by charging authors via high-cost article processing charge, APC, as well as the provision of data services to support monitoring and evaluation processes that subsidize research reward and funding mechanisms. In addition to the economic dependence caused by this business model, there is also a risk of increasing subordination of academic communities, especially in peripheral economies, to evaluation criteria and methodologies guided by external and even algorithmic parameters, often far from their interests and realities. To a large extent, the so-called internationalization-based quality criteria determine these parameters and feed into these businesses. There is a risk that the Global South be transformed into mere data producers as raw material for what is considered advanced science, or mere consumers of products and services derived from value-added data. One of the consequences of these processes is that research agendas have been dominated by issues that do not necessarily correspond to the needs and priorities of most of those located in less developed economies. This reveals the existence of two scientific worlds and a new form of peripheral integration on the global stage. Science and technology are thus at the core of major contemporary geopolitical inequalities at the world level. Therefore, the very idea of openness is under dispute. One must question opening for whom and under what conditions. My second point is that the challenge of open science involves more than having access to the scientific literature or research data. It also involves the recognition of other epistemologies and narratives, as well as the contributions both from the peripheries and from below. The current crisis corresponds to a crisis of solutions, which demands new ways of approaching problems, other knowledge bases, and also other ways of doing science. Since the end of the 1960s, criticisms were directed at the role of the dominant scientific and technological patterns in the deterioration of the planet's environmental conditions. Questions have also been raised about the epistemic universality of established science. Many point out that Western scientific paradigms have promoted invisibility and created obstacles to the development and recognition of other and more diverse scientific trajectories and types of knowledge that could make room for more sustainable development roads. The thesis of a universal thought as equivalent to modern Western science has been contested, giving way to the idea that knowledge has a perspective character, that regimes of truth and epistemic authority are formed based on institutional rules conditioned by power relations and cultural biases. In this context, a set of counter-hegemonic views on knowledge and science has emerged, expressing in Michel Foucault's words a true insurrection of subjected knowledge. This is part of the OCSD-net, Open and Collaborative Science in Development, Open Science Manifesto, which has a panorama of this in terms of post-colonial, decolonial, in open science movements. They originate from various lines of thought, inspired by and inspiring social movements from environmentalism to feminist and queer theories, anti-racist, post-colonial, decolonial, and subaltern studies, the pedagogy of the oppressed, like Paulo Freire, the ecology of knowledges, and the epistemologies of the South. Overall, these lines of thought have sought to make visible the worldviews and epistemic frames of traditional peoples, vulnerable populations, socially stigmatized groups, lay expertise, and also peripheral science, valuing their role to face the present planetary crisis. They propose to promote what they consider to be cognitive justice, paradigm order, border thinking, among other terms. Part of these lines of thought assumes that contemporary scientific knowledge must be situated within historical, geopolitical asymmetries. All those propositions may open up new ways to resituate science as a creative and open endeavor. At the present crisis, science is called directly to action and to reveal its role and mode of operation. It is required not only new agendas, what to do, but above all, new ways of intervention, how to do it. From this perspective, it's worth reflecting on what the pandemic reveals about the possibilities, limits, and new challenges to science and to open science. What is at stake is not merely the quantitative dimension of openness, more volume and speed, that is also crucial, but also its qualitative aspect, the kind of knowledge we need to produce. In this sense, open science should expand, or rather transcend, the scientific field and the scientific communities. Openness also supposes the greater porosity of science in its dialogue with the broad spectrum of knowledge-producing actors and spaces, not only the institutionalized and certified ones. It implies the overthrowing of hierarchies, of established sources of authority and reputation. Some points are worth mentioning about this point. A first aspect concerns the need to renegotiate the relationship between science and society. There is a crisis of institutional representation and of representative democracy that has also affected the public perception of science. It has reinforced a movement of discredit in the methods and findings of scientific knowledge. This includes positions such as the denial of the current climate emergency and its anthropogenic causes, flat earth theories, opposition to vaccination, as well as reactions to scientific advances in ethnic, racial, and gender issues, women's and mental health, drug policies, among other topics. The pandemic brought new ingredients to this scenario. On the one hand, by making risk and vulnerability even more visible than the climate emergency itself, it reinforced in some sectors the recognition of the role of science as a strategic part in finding solutions to the crisis. On the other hand, a large part of public opinion in different countries remains refractory to scientific evidence and permeable to the proliferation of fake science, intensifying controversies regarding the measures needed to face the virus and the disease. It then became more evident the need for new languages, forms, and means of communication, not only in a single way from science to society, but also in the opposite direction, for science to listen to what society has to say and contribute to. A second aspect refers to the role of scientific information in changing behavior, in particular for coping with COVID-19, its causes and consequences. Information is a way of recording and circulating knowledge that otherwise could be locked up in individuals, specialists, scientists, and laboratories. But the mere availability of information does not prompt action. It is necessary to mobilize the subjective and ethical dimensions to promoting social responsibility, empathy, solidarity, and respect for diversity. Sensitization and mobilization of a wide range of actors, including affected and vulnerable groups, governments, and private sectors, is crucial. It is also necessary to democratize the ways and competences to produce, appropriate, and make use of data and information, as well as to assess their source and veracity. Nevertheless, crises may also and may not, unfortunately, open up new opportunities. We hope we may. The question is, to what extent does the pressure for alternative development styles lead science to be permeable to other values and practices, or even motivate paradigmatic shifts in science power structures? The ethical political question that is posed there is what counts and who counts? My third point is that citizen science may play a significant role in this scenario. Even though the contribution of amateurs to science has taken place since at least the 19th century, the term citizen science only appears at the turn of the 1980s to the 1990s. Citizen science initiatives have been expanding around the world in the last 2 decades, gaining visibility in government and international organizations' agendas, especially in matters related to the Sustainable Development Goals. Citizen science is now part of the open science movements. Citizen science designates a set of actions, methodologies, and tools that promotes social engagement and mobilizes the contributions of non-scientists to the production of knowledge and data relevant to the advancement of science. It consists mainly of voluntary citizen collaboration in activities such as collecting and interpreting data useful for research, such as images, sounds, and other types of records, improving as a consequence the quality of research results and lowering its costs. Here we have some examples of national and regional citizen science initiatives among the many existing on various topics and distributed in various locations with different scopes of actions. Science Data in the United States, the European Citizen Science Platform, recently launched, Fundación Ciencia Ciudadana de Chile, Centópolis, Argentina, the Network in Biodiversity in Brazil. Citizen science projects and initiatives have been facilitated by new computational resources, graphical users interfaces, photo upload and validation, web applications based on geographic information systems, simple online data feed systems, which can be used in smartphones, applications, and other mobile devices that make it possible to connect directly to the internet. These new digital platforms and tools facilitate the connection and contribution of volunteers. Here you have some possible use of citizen science from data collection to more participatory methodologies, and the idea of the right to research. Everyone has the right to research. Criticism has been expressed of the fact that citizen science initiatives, traditionally focusing on the participation of amateurs, volunteers, and enthusiasts in the collection of scientific data, have normally taken place in affluent locations, excluding illiterate or literate populations living in remote areas. From this point of view, the concept of extreme citizen science is advocated by the London Group, whose focus is to allow any community anywhere in the world start a citizen science project to deal with their own issues. Citizen science has also been urged to give prominence to non-scientists in the formulation of questions, hypotheses, and analyses that contributed to new approaches and participatory cultures in the ways of doing science, as well as to influence and support decision-making and formulation of public policies that are scientifically and socially based, especially on controversial or conflicting issues. By involving affected populations from the beginning and at various stages of research, citizen science approaches may result in social learning processes more robust and achieve greater social impact. The engagement of non-scientists as volunteers in citizen science initiatives is not only motivated by pleasure, leisure, or even altruistic reasons. It is also driven by the citizens' desire to intervene more actively on issues that directly interfere in their lives, and whose decisions are often based and restricted to expert opinion. New challenges arise for the adoption of citizen science practices, such as the curation and scientific validation of data provided by non-specialists, the informed consent of volunteers to possible uses of the data produced, the explicit recognition of contributions made by citizen scientists, including co-authorship in publications derived from them, intellectual property systems, licenses, and benefit-sharing mechanisms derived from the results achieved by the collaboration. Management protocols and policies, including FAIR, and we'll talk more about this, the CARE principles. Citizen science initiatives and methods have been increasingly mobilized to face and reduce the risks of disasters and emergency situations, contributing to the mapping and prevention of risks, as well to the development of warning, monitoring, and management systems. The use of citizen science methodologies with regard to environmental, social, and sanitary disaster and emergency situations has grown as a way of promoting public engagement, especially of affected communities and social groups in adaptation, mitigation, and resilience actions. In the case of the COVID-19, these contributions are even more necessary, considering the still existing knowledge gaps about the disease and its implications. They have been oriented both to promote citizen engagement and resilience in facing the emergency and to mobilize a collective intelligence in the design of solutions. Citizen science initiatives in the context of the COVID pandemic have been affected in two ways. On the one hand, initiatives that involve face-to-face activities and field observations have been hampered by the limits to physical mobility and social proximity imposed to fight the disease. On the other hand, Internet contributions have been encouraged and favored, either because people stay connected online longer or because they become more familiar with the use of digital media. Recent research that I developed with Luana Rocha as part of our research group research activities revealed a variety of actors that promote citizen science initiatives regarding the pandemic, ranging from more established organizations such as academic institutions, NGOs, and startups with social interests, to maker groups, community organizations, and volunteer groups with no institutional link or structures. Here we have some examples. We have published an article about this research, some citizen science initiatives on networks of solidarity, data production about the pandemics, and also maker groups making API for the population in general. Our survey showed that these experiments may promote capacity building in the use of community-based data feeding tools and systems, broaden the scope and democratize the perspective of scientific research, increase learning and the effectiveness of actions and policies in dealing with emergency situations, going beyond the so-called expert opinions. How to enable different local groups to make use of the different sets of data available remains a key issue to be solved. The choice of the type of tools and applications should facilitate citizen mobilization. Finally, citizen science and other participatory approaches are not enough to increase local populations' influence in the design of strategies and public policies. Crucial to these ends are the governance systems that affect the related decision-making processes. The dissemination of citizen science initiatives involves different dimensions. Social culture, the willingness, on the one hand, the willingness of volunteers to contribute to the initiatives. On the other hand, the recognition and willingness of scientists to guide and use the data produced, obtained. Political, institutional, the support of public, private, and non-governmental organizations for the development of these initiatives. Economic, funding resources to develop and maintain relevant initiatives and infrastructure, technical capacity to develop, make available, and use applications and other necessary technical devices and infrastructures, including internet connection in remote areas. My fourth and last point will reinforce the thesis of a common science or a science of the common. Going back to my first point, we must face the fact that there is no consensus about what the planet should be, nor about the meaning of living and being together. An ecology of knowledges corresponds in its turn to an ecology of powers. As much as deforestation and forest fires impact biodiversity stocks, the necropolitics against indigenous and traditional communities, but also against migrants, social minorities, Black and poor people, has great impact on knowledge diversity. Life, or it means the right to existence and the possibility of a variety modes of existence, constitute the very body of an ecology of knowledges as a source of creativity and as a condition for designing future alternatives. In this slide, you have a proposal from indigenous peoples groups to combine the FAIR principles for data management, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, with the CARE principles of sovereignty of traditional populations over their data, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. This is not only an academic debate. It has significant repercussions both in the field of politics and policies. Development policies and knowledge policies are increasingly intertwined. On the other hand, there is no single solution and policy prescription. Instead, there is a myriad of alternatives that could take different forms for different societies in different places and times. This supposes to broaden and deepen our theoretical and conceptual frameworks in order to further develop a point of view based on the perspectives, characteristics, and potentialities of different social territorial contexts. Therefore, as much as open science and citizen science need to face the current global emergency challenges, they have necessarily a situated character. This is a crucial issue if you want to promote the great conversation in science. Such conversation indicates going beyond an ethics of coexistence between different epistemological matrices towards a perspective of polyphony, of communication in its original etymological sense of becoming common. In this sense, the Spanish researcher Antonio Lafuente proposes the term common science. The hint common implies not only the sense of common goods, the commons. Common is above all a relational concept. It mainly refers to the in-between, the relationship with diversity, with the other. Our task should be to create open spaces and open infrastructures in which the diversity of lines of thought and ways of being can speak and can be heard, recognizing and considering the different actors and visions, not only the dominant or institutionalized ones, but also the peripheral, the emerging ones. Science needs this criticism. Above all, science that dictates standards, parameters, and protocols and which dominates infrastructures worldwide. Open science and citizen science also means making explicit these existing tensions, conflicts, and differences. It can be a road to the construction of a common world and a common future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarita, for a very interesting presentation. There are no comments in the discussion, but I would ask people, because we have library representatives from all over the world, if you are involved with citizen science in your university, please tell us in the discussion.
Sorry.
I have a question to you, Sarita. You had a timeline showing the evolvement from open access to open science. And in a way, when we are reaching open access, started almost like a revolutionary movement with visions about that everything should be open. And now we see that Elsevier and all the great publishers, they embrace open access and intend to earn more money on open access than they did before. And now the scope has expanded with open science. But in many cases, we don't lack research on, for instance, climate crisis. We lack action. And as I hear you, when you say, then we have open citizen science as a way to renegotiate the connection between society and research. And citizen science is more than open science. So it's obvious for the libraries, it's an obvious task for the libraries to give access to everyone and to publish everything open. But citizen science is more than that. How could we as university libraries act within our institutions with the citizen science?
Okay. We have mapped many initiatives, mainly in Brazil, but at a world level on citizen science in different issues. In IBICT, the research institution where I work, we are developing a citizen science platform that must be launched in the next months. And the idea is to give support to other citizen science experiments, projects, because there is a need of infrastructure to develop this kind of initiatives. At the university, I don't know if in English you use the extension department, the department that make the connection of the research developed at the university with the public, the society in general. We had some projects using citizen science methodology, but also in different departments, mainly those working with environmental issues. We have much more citizen science projects in the sustainable development topics than in other topics. So I think we have now a Brazilian network in citizen science that put together trying to connect these different experiments and also to put that in connection with international organizations. In terms of the relationship between citizen science and other open science movements, as I said, we understand open science as a movement of movements. we understand that many of these movements were originated before and independent of open access or even open science movement, but now they are being connected between them, because you cannot talk about open access publications without talking about open data, open infrastructure. This deals with the open software movement, the open hardware movement, and citizen science also needs to be connected to these other movements, such as the open infrastructures, the open data. And so we think that it's not only open science, not only an umbrella term where we have independent lines of intervention to open science, but they are more and more interdependent. They need each other. And you see that, for instance, citizen science now meet all the lines of traditions, research traditions and intellectual traditions, as post-colonial, decolonial, feminist. So you see that these different approaches need to dialogue and to learn from each other. In terms of libraries, I think it's not only libraries, more and more, it's not only places where you have access to literature. Libraries are meeting points. And we see that there is a very interesting movement in many libraries to be also a space for learning and giving support for citizen science initiatives. And in the same way that libraries, at least in developing countries, have been very important in terms of digital inclusion. So I think libraries have a very interesting role and should be following the discussion and learning more about citizen science approaches and methodologies.
Thank you. So that's a clear message. Library can have a role to connect the universities with the movements within citizen science as a meeting point for citizen science initiatives. We'll go home and start that work. We've got a question. Do you think open access will survive the big companies that have all the rights to ebooks and the research and information products?
We hope so. The original Budapest Open Access Initiative promoters, they are very upset about that. There are many people organizing and publishing and discussing about these new business models. Every big publisher now say that is open access publication, and we see that they are having lots of money from this business model. And in Latin America, where we have now we can make a distinction between the gold open access and the diamond open access. We say that in Latin America we prefer the new diamond open access because we have this tradition of an open access without APC charges, at least this high cost APC charges. Of course, we have this challenging of making open access economic sustainable. But we believe that the support from the public support, the government support, continues to be very important. So we are very worried about, for instance, as the Plan S in Europe promotes oblige, open notes, open access for all the scientific publications, but the problem is that it can cost too high, and mainly for non-European authors to have access of this business model, of this open access business model. So I think you have to, as originally the librarians were very, very important in terms of the open access movement. They continue now to be a very important sector in terms of keeping the original open access agenda. And the issues of the e-books is very, very difficult. You know that there is a very important discussion about how the e-books that could be a way of easy access to scientific literature can be a barrier as an opposite idea of open access.
Yeah, but one could put the question different, not whether open access will survive, but whether the big companies can survive a real open access regime with diamond open access, with no reading charge and no publicity charge. What is the future for the publishers?
How open access will survive the big companies that have all the rights to the e-books? I didn't. The question is, the big publisher will survive? If the big publisher will survive? This is the question.
Yeah,
of course, they are not only surviving, but the monopolies are growing up. They have high rates of revenues. No doubt that the problem is not if the big publisher will survive. The problem is the less funding authors will survive.
So when you ask for a new regime for publishing, you think that that includes that big companies shall increase their revenue?
They are increasing their revenue in this new business model. And I think that you have to return to the idea of the original movement of open access. And when you talk about the emergency situations, which is the topic of this lecture, we see that some of these big companies, they open the access for a very short period. For instance, for Zika virus or for the coronavirus or COVID-19 disease. And now many of the publishers open for a short period to have access to people have access in open access to literature related to these pandemics, to this emergency. But the problem is that emergencies situations now is not just isolated in time and spaces. We have an era of emergencies. The sanitary, the environmental, social emergencies and disaster situations now is the new normal. So we need a stabilized environment of open access and open science in order to accumulate learning and knowledge for future emergence that certainly will arrive.
In my country, all the publishers open their digital resources for some few months.
Yeah.
And in the end of the year, the students asked, why did we get we got less digital access during the COVID period than we had before? And I said, no, you got access for 3 months, but the COVID period lasted longer. Yeah.
And another issue is that which part of the science should be open during this period? We see that many disciplines, many areas that are not visible or directed, linked to the problem, they are also important. The social, economic, culture, and basic research that maybe you cannot understand why it is important, but as we advance in knowledge about this emergency, we see that there are many topics that are related and should be point of research. No? So how to limit which should be open and which not.
Yeah. When you showed us the term open science, that included also learning texts and learning material. And when we originally spoke about open access, it was access to research results. And we argued that most of the research has been publicly funded, and then the public should have access. But learning material is something different. Do you have any comment to that? That
Yes.
means that students will not be have to buy their textbooks anymore?
Open education is part is one of the movements that is now part of this broader spectrum of open science. There is a very important discussion about how education materials and education infrastructure should be influenced by the open science movements. For instance, not only the MOOCs, the open courses, but also the open infrastructures. In countries as Brazil, developing countries, the most part of populations and students and poor people, they don't have access to the internet, they don't have access to computers. It's totally different from your country, Lars. And so we have 1.5 years of these students with no access to classes. And at the same time, you have the big companies gaining a lot with the pandemics and the information technology, the internet companies. They are the most that are having high revenues with the pandemic. So we have a very important debate on not only the educational materials, but also the educational infrastructure for access of these students to classes, to be continue connected, to have access to learning in school.
There is one more comment in the discussion. I heard that Russia has an open access repository for all the world's publications. If so, what are they going to do with it? And that addresses also that it's not the technical side, but the copyright law side, which is perhaps the most difficult one.
It is one of the things. There is a study at the University of São Paulo showing how the open access movement could not achieve universal results because the pirate means are very, very strong. The black access, you say, and I'm not sure if the Russian repository, the person is talking about the science hub, no? Yeah.
Research hub.
Yes, it continues to be a very important source of accessing materials. It says a lot about the open access movement. People remain having who have access of this kind of repository because open access is not so universal.
Oh. Well, Sarita, we are running out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation and for the discussion and for the challenges that you have given us. So we can go home and start to look into citizen science and work with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Have a good meeting.